Finally, after several years, I'll be revisiting Andy Sachs's outfit in an attempt to knit the Devil Wears Prada, the sequel. Wait a second, are you saying they already made one? Okay, I was not oblivious to this, and if you saw my YouTube post and Patreon poll some time ago, you already knew I already knew this. So this time, let's talk about movies, more specifically about sequels, and if they really do make the world a better place. While we do, I'll be knitting a piece inspired by Andy's Argyle midi flare skirt, which quite fittingly, no pun intended, never gets any attention. The question is, will this be a sequel worth making? Before we dive in, let's get into the nitty-gritty once again. I'm determined to make this piece solely from what I already have, so I'm using 2 different weights for this project because they happen to be the right colours. Was this a little daunting? Yes, because although there was room for it to work, there was a lot more filled with unknowns. I used a DK stone / beige wool yarn to start with, and an Aran weight blue wool to contrast. Obviously, swatching was unskippable. I intended to leave the diamond lattice detailing until after the base knit was complete, because duplicate stitching seemed a lot more straightforward and efficient to me than juggling 3 yarns all at once, but I won't lie, it would have been nice to work everything up at the same time. The problem was that I wasn't sure if I had the right colour for this detail. The one I had in mind, the one I used for my Blade Runner cardigan earlier this year, just didn't match well with the cool tones of the other 2, and my only other option, the one I used for my ribbed shorts pattern, wasn't what I had in mind. That said, it still had potential. Now let's get into the thick of it. The back panel. Not too long ago, I made a poll asking you what your thoughts on movie sequels were, and the overall sentiment was very, incredibly reasonable. The options were always, never, sometimes, yes please if I like the original, and no thank you if I like the original. The difference this time was that you could choose more than one option. Sometimes definitely came out on top as the most popular option at 74%, followed by yes at 14%, no at 9%, and finally never at 2%. These are all rounded, of course. And honestly, this pretty much sums up how I personally feel about sequels too, so this felt very validating. What we can all certainly agree on is that no one's asking for sequels to be mandatory, with always receiving 0 votes. And yes, the feeling of not wanting to hear another word about another sequel is also deeply relatable. When it came to picking more than one option, this seemed to make up half of the yes and no options, the most common pairing being that if you were open to sequels sometimes, then you were actually less open to sequels from an IP you already liked, but only marginally. Even with that said, the yes if I like the original option was still slightly more popular overall, so you could just put this down to the limitations of the poll itself. If you voted and or left a comment, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with me. It was a real pleasure reading through your comments. If you'd like to take part in future polls, do consider joining us on Patreon if you haven't already. It's totally free. You also get access to posts and updates that you won't find anywhere else. Link is of course down in the description below. As you expressed so eloquently, sometimes sequels work and sometimes they don't. The intention and execution are what matters, and the nuance is everything. But before we can start talking about the Devil Wears Prada sequel,
I've changed my mind.
I had some catching up to do, because when you think of knitting a skirt, one of the main concerns that comes to mind is the worry that it might not cover everything, that it might turn out a bit see-through given the very holy nature of knitted fabric. So I overcorrected in my swatching by sizing down my needles, especially because one of my yarns was a lighter weight than the other. And to be fair, the thought of a dense knit fabric seemed more attractive than a looser drapier one that could stretch and lengthen over time. Even though the searing power of the sun wasn't going to penetrate through this fortress of wool, the truth was, on a larger scale, I just didn't like how it was turning out. Not to mention that the amount I'd sized down needle-wise was proving a little difficult to keep up with. My hands had been asking questions my brain wasn't ready to answer until this point. In hindsight, I'm sure blocking would have improved things a lot, more than I would have initially thought, but I really couldn't imagine making it through to the end of the project like this. The worst part about changing the gauge of color work is that not only do you have to find your gauge again, but you also have to rework the color pattern and hope for the best. Luckily, it wasn't that complicated. In the end, it turned out that the transparency thing wasn't actually a concern, since the stranded color work with floats across the back gave more than enough coverage, and the new larger gauge was sturdy enough. So was all of this for nothing? Yeah, pretty much. In hindsight, of course. The side panel. Now that we've established that the topic of sequels isn't really black and white, but more grey and varied like the base colour of this knit, it's probably time to talk about the Devil Wears Prada sequel. I'm just gonna say it. I haven't watched it, and I don't plan to. So I probably won't for a while, if ever. Which is kind of saying a lot because I really enjoyed the original movie, and Meryl Streep is one of the very few actors who are often the sole reason I will watch a movie I otherwise have little to no interest in. But when it came to the Devil Wears Prada sequel, I just had more reasons to not watch it than to watch it. The original is a source of some really fond and admittedly unique memories, and I think that's precisely where my main reason for not watching it truly lies. So this is my second attempt. I've sized up the needles and it's definitely looking, in my opinion, a lot better. In terms of the underside, the floats look a lot nicer than I thought they would. I did a little experimenting with the edges here, but I kinda wish I hadn't. Since I sized up the needles, the diamonds are slightly bigger, but not too much bigger. If I compare the current diamonds to my swatch diamonds, I think you can probably tell a slight difference there. It should be fine. Yeah, I'm just gonna keep working up, and then I'm going to start my shaping, and then that will be the back panel. So why make my own sequel to an old video based on this very IP? Isn't that hypocritical? Yes, with one caveat. I decided to do this because I felt confident enough in the possibility of doing an equally good, if not better job this time. Which, given how long it's been since my first video, and the homely charm of the original skirt, was a pretty safe bet to make. And I just wasn't that confident about the movie sequel being able to live up to the original, let alone surpass it. Apples and oranges, of course. I thought about it, watching the sequel on the big screen, but I was apprehensive, a little scared even. So I waited for the first reviews to come in before making my mind up. And they were pretty much what I assumed they would be, or rather what I could hope for, realistically. The general consensus was that it wasn't a bad movie, it was still a fun watch, but it didn't hold a candle to the original, and it would be on you if you were hoping it to. That pretty much cemented things for me, because the irrational fear was that if I went to watch it, then the experience of the new film would inevitably taint my fondest memories of the original, or worse yet, take up some of the same space. Sure, it's not that deep, but neither is not participating, and not watching this new sequel was a much easier option than going to watch it. I already have a large enough catalogue of regrettable movie theatre trips, more than enough to last me a lifetime. There's only so much a girl can take, and I wasn't willing to risk it this time. So yes, I forfeited the opportunity to know exactly what happened and give you my honest review. That is currently the only regret that I feel, and I'm living with it. My mind has been made up for now, but I'm curious about what you think. Did you watch it, or did you choose not to? If you did you enjoy it? It later came to my attention that this movie was not entirely free from backlash. Admittedly, I wasn't paying attention to any of the promo, and I only learned of things long after starting on the skirt. So to condense things down to their essence, despite the publicized efforts to note the push for body positivity and inclusivity in the sequel, as if to say, we're totally okay with the fact it's not the 2000s anymore, seriously. The creators somehow managed to promote a highly questionable depiction of an Asian American character in a pre-release clip from the movie itself. The character in question was Jin Chao, Andy's new assistant, and she was depicted as an eager-to-please, large glasses-wearing, clashingly plaid-clad, high-achieving young woman. Basically, a relatively standard Hollywood nerd. What she was doing working at a fashion magazine with sky-high grades and no discernible interest in fashion, it's hard to say from just the clip alone. And these aren't just superficial assumptions I'm making off of how she's presented, it's literally based on what she says. Jay, nobody wanted to work in your department because it's not actual fashion, so I just got it. Isn't that cool? A. Very. Jay, you don't want me. A. I didn't say that. Jay, if you don't want me, you can interview someone else. That's totally fine. I did go to Yale. 3.86 GPA leads soprano of the Whiffenpoofs, and my ACT score was 36 on the very first try, but A. No, you seem great. I'm happy to have you. For the full professional effect, you'll have to watch the actual clip, so this is only the gist. Look, I don't think I need to go through why this raised some valid questions. This is a stereotype that we've seen depicted over and over again, and the over-animated performance coupled with the clear power dynamic only exacerbates things further. This scene is basically showing benevolent Andy's unconditional acceptance of Jin, irrespective of her impressive accomplishments, which must be something new to such an insecure high achiever who still feels the need to prove themselves, as they probably did for their primary caregivers or something. And for that, Jin could not be more grateful. And I'm just gonna say it, it's kind of giving white savior. There is a lot to go through with this one, and we won't go through everything here, but it's worth noting a particular pattern that kept resurfacing, which is that most of the pushback against the East Asian people voicing their disappointment and offense was coming from non-East Asian people. And I could just kind of leave it there. But one argument I kept seeing in defense of the movie was that Jin Chao, which is the questionable anglicized pronunciation of her name but the only one made available, was just meant to be a callback to an early Andy from the original film. You know, the one who couldn't dress herself and didn't care about fashion. And this might be why this clip was chosen as a scene to promote the movie. But here's the thing. For one, Andy didn't fulfill a problematic racial stereotype, nor was she depicted as some grade-grubbing, people-pleasing geek with rejection sensitivity, all pretty suggestive of a stereotypical tiger parent upbringing. If anything, Andy literally suffered from the opposite, i.e. an emotionally supportive family background and an overconfidence that was the catalyst in the very same scene that inspired this very outfit. Let's not forget the obvious part. Andy had a whole movie dedicated to her journey and development into a well-rounded character. But from what I've been able to gather so far, this was nowhere near the case for Jin Chao. I'm not saying these things can't exist in a character at all because of their racial background, but what I am saying is that there were a few too many for just one character, in just one scene, and a promotional one at that. Stating the obvious, but since I haven't actually watched the film, you can argue that I'm just missing context, which, fair point, but it's hard to see how further context would excuse the very deliberate cut and promotion of the clip itself. A stereotype is a stereotype. Before we continue, I'm about to commit yet another sizable frog, and that's because I shifted the pattern one column too far to the left when establishing the first colorwork row. My chart was correct, but my execution was, let's call it distracted. Since the colorwork was otherwise correct, it ended up being one of those things that you only end up noticing when you finally end up noticing it, unless you actually follow the chart that you carefully prepared earlier, which I didn't. Truth be told, the freehander in me is always trying to escape, so it's really my fault for making a chart that I barely intended to follow in the first place. I got a little overconfident. This was an easy mistake to make, especially while multitasking, but it was difficult to fix, so starting over made sense. Duplicate stitching over mistakes can be an option, but it wasn't preferable in this case. Could I have just stuck with it? Yes, but I didn't want to because it would have affected the pattern continuity, even if only slightly and barely noticeably. Luckily, this was the smallest panel, so it could have been worse. Anyway, let's get back to it. On the audience side of things, the examples I saw defending this depiction of Jin Chao appear to be some form of cope born out of ignorance, innocent or not, a fierce loyalty to the IP, or worse. And if the internet is anything, it's full of all these things. Is it possible to accept that the depiction of Jin Chao could and should have been different, but that doesn't have to define the rest of the movie for everyone? At the same time, it's valid if it does. Because, let's be real, she didn't have to be a living, breathing, walking, talking stereotype. That was a conscious choice. Although there are undoubtedly some who unironically relate to her or think she reminds them of someone they've known in real life, these are more or less exceptions, as are most caricatures in real life. The cold hard truth is, Jin Chao isn't a real person, and she wasn't written by anyone from the same background. So her portrayal is based on a very limited and superficial outsider perspective, and cynically, a rather pointed one at that. So do people who defended the character actually like Jin Chao, or do they like the stereotypical depiction of an Asian American woman by non-Asian writers? Whether the intended audiences think the portrayal was acceptable or not, the inability or at times refusal to call a spade is perhaps the crux here, albeit a symptom of the wider condition, namely the loyal, indiscriminate defense of the favorited IP, whichever it may be, because this is precisely the sentiment and force that sustains and drives the genre that is the sequel. There, I said it. It could be argued that in this day and age, the sequel has evolved into a separate entity outside of the original. Am I arguing that it shares more with other sequels than the very work it's meant to follow on and evolve from? Maybe. Of course, this isn't always the case, and we'll get into some examples of this later. Although this sequel ticked the boxes that make you want to watch it, like reuniting the original cast, as well as providing character progression and updates, it also started to tick some not-so-great yet equally familiar boxes. Specifically the ones often associated with unsolicited sequels and remakes, such as not living up to the original, an over-reliance on an existing legacy, and some very avoidable tokenism. Is this not the emergence of an actual, and dare I say parasitic genre at this point? At its core, this isn't even about The Devil Wears Prada. This is just a default destination for any favorited film turned franchise these days. Can you blame me for not wanting to be disappointed, let alone pay for it in time, money, and emotion? Must the only hope of remedy be joining in and watching it, and thus actively participating in the movie sequel industrial complex in some catch-22, courtesy of late-stage capitalism? Maybe it is. Maybe it must. Despite my faded interest, all of this did bring up some more thoughts and questions. The movie sequel industrial complex. In Season 1 of Game of Thrones, spoiler alert, I guess, Khal Drogo falls ill with an infection from a wound. Daenerys Targaryen, sensing that he may not survive, asks the captured healer Mirri Maz Duur to heal him with blood magic. The healer warns that only life can pay for another, but Daenerys proceeds. This of course doesn't heal him as intended and leaves him catatonic, yet alive. There's more to it, as you'll know if you watch the series, but the reason I bring it up is because it's a familiar trope. Specifically, it's an example of the resurrection trope, more or less. Although Drogo is technically still living when the blood magic is used, the sentiment remains that the attempt to keep him alive results in something that leads to the tale as old as time, be careful what you wish for trope. To relate things back to the topic at hand, the sequel, in a roundabout way, feels like some form of this blood magic, more often than not these days. Instead of preserving the life of a warlord, it's often used to preserve the financial success of a fictional work and/or universe. I headed over to tvtropes.org to see if there was some more weight to this, and lo and behold, there was quite a lot. So here's a list of the tropes I felt were most relevant, and yes, I have avoided using certain words because of YouTube. In an attempt to humanize the sequel, remake, or reboot, imagine original works in place of the quote-unquote character. Resurrection sickness. A character has various physical ailments after coming back to life. Soulless shell. In some cases, reanimating the body won't necessarily restore the old soul or mind. The body is alive, but the mind inside is gone or suppressed. This one seems to match the example from earlier. Unwanted revival. A character is gone or comatose and for whatever reason isn't happy about being revived from that state. Inhuman human. Someone is brought back with their soul and personality intact, but their body has deteriorated in the process. Necromantic. Villain's motive is to revive a loved one. Refusing paradise. A character chooses to return instead of going to a peaceful afterlife. Resurrected for a job. A third party resurrects the hero and sends him on the quest. Resurrection loop. A character that is fated or cursed to pass multiple times. I think it's safe to assume that there are examples that come to mind for some, if not all of these, whether they're sequels, remakes, or reboots. Inconveniently, since I generally avoid sequels and have very unmemorable memories of the ones I have watched, I looked at the compilations available online and nothing seemed to evoke that "OMG, that was so bad" feeling I was looking for. Because the truth may just be less about sequels being an affront to the original movies, and more a case of them being underwhelming, forgettable, or just not appealing enough to even watch in the first place, which would really help to explain why none of them stood out. Out of the few I could recall, there were all Disney sequels I'm certain I watched, but just don't remember at all, like The Little Mermaid 2, 102 Dalmatians, Mulan 2, and possibly at least one of the other Aladdin movies. I haven't seen any of the live-action remakes, and I'm not looking to change that anytime soon. But anyway, these now feel more like lost media fever dreams than actual lived experiences. I don't even remember if any of them were any good. I do, however, have very real memories of the originals. But even though I barely remember these sequels, if at all, it would have been more effort to not watch them than to just watch them, especially when everyone else was at the time. I could continue, but let's switch things up a little and focus more on the sequels that actually got it right. Let's start with one you already mentioned, Shrek. There's no need for me to remind you of the well-earned status of the Shrek cinematic universe. However, I have to admit that I lost track after the first sequel, and I can't speak for the rest, but do I really need to? The first two movies were so good that it's not surprising that things continued to great success, even if what followed never quite lived up to them. I'd have to watch each and every one to really talk about them any more than that, and I don't know if I'm ready just yet. Shrek project on the way? Who knows? Toy Story. The first sequel was, for me, more memorable than the first movie, which is a huge deal given how much of a game changer it was. When it came to whichever sequels I watched of the later ones, I can recall them being watchable, but that's about it. They were objectively good, just not very memorable for me. This is all my own opinion as well, so feel free to fight me in the comments. I think the Godfather trilogy is a no-brainer. Part 1 is still my favourite, but Part 2 is what sequels were always meant to be and more. The third escapes my memory, but I don't recall it being bad, just not the same level of good. Blade Runner 2049 is a rare and perhaps close to perfect example of a sequel done right. Ridley Scott's original was and remains a masterpiece, and the sequel, directed by Denis Villeneuve nearly 4 decades later, also stood on its own merit and gave us something different to sink our teeth into. It reached a perfect balance between loyalty and paying homage to the original, while also creating a new visual world that felt like a believable yet contemporary progression from the first. The story itself was intertwined with the previous, yet also held its own with new characters and solid narratives. Basically, it had something to say that echoed the profundity of the first Blade Runner without feeling like a tired, overdone, or directionless husk. You didn't feel like you were watching tired tropes running off of first film fumes, and I for one was glad it happened, especially considering how truly disappointing it could have been. Again, I could go on, but I won't. sometimes sequels work and sometimes they don't. If you're wondering why I haven't mentioned any of the giant franchises like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and the MCU, etc., etc., it's because I never got into them enough to comment. And I'm not trying to make anyone mad, because if it's been this long and I still don't get it, then I just may never get it. And I do get it on a very superficial level, I just never got into it. But that might just be something to look forward to, depending on the franchise, of course. From an outsider perspective, some of the movies from these franchises are prime examples of sequels that didn't need to happen, but alas, the demand and fanbase were there, ready and willing. How good or bad the sequels were could be deemed somewhat irrelevant. I'm not naming names, but even if I wanted to, I'd have to look them up and triangulate my very patchy memory. So what's the difference between a good sequel and a bad sequel? I think you already expressed this really well in the comments you shared under the poll and YouTube post. So to recap and elaborate, the key differences between the ones that work and the ones that don't appear to be some combination of the following. Intention. Is the intention to add to the original story in some way, or to rework the IP into something that stands well on its own? Is it just to make a quick buck? Room. Is there even any room for a sequel? Is there anything left to add? Or was everything pretty much wrapped up by the end of the first story? If not, then is it just a case of wrapping up a mediocre formulaic narrative inside the original packaging? Budget. Does a lower budget force the creators to think more outside the box, or does it limit the quality? Does a higher budget just mean more bells and whistles to distract from a lack of substance, or is it making up for what the first one lacked? Creators. Are the same people involved in making the sequel or sequels, or is the soul being switched out for another one, with or without blood magic? If it's different for the sequel, is it an opportunity or a disadvantage? Of course, it's not as simple as just these factors, but one thing appears to stay the same no matter what, and that's us, the audience. Am I being a little hyperbolic? Yes. Clearly not all of us want to see a sequel, even if we love the original, but clearly a lot of us do, because they just keep making them. And given how much money they earn relative to previously unknown releases, there's no real reason for them to stop. The Devil Wears Prada 2 earned $233 million globally in its opening weekend, which although is no Barbie movie, it's still a lot relative to the average independent. That's still $16 million more than Michael, the Michael Jackson biopic, which was released the week before and had a lot of legendary star appeal backing it, though neither could compete with Super Mario Galaxy, which earned $373 million only weeks before. It was an extended holiday weekend, but is anyone surprised? For studios, sequels and well-established IP are safe, even certain bets. And with streaming being what it is today, it's easy to understand why things have gone in this direction. To provide a comparison with a story and IP we were less familiar with, every one of these movies surpassed the popular Project Hail Mary release, which grossed a total of $141 million over its opening weekend. Although you could argue that it's based on a novel by the same guy who wrote The Martian, so it was still a relatively safe bet anyway. Clearly, early performance has a lot more to do with familiarity and existing fandom than the actual film itself, but this kind of guaranteed performance doesn't only apply to movies. Let's be honest, no one's buying, much less writing and singing songs about Chanel for Coco. Barely anyone knows modern-day Balenciaga for Cristobal. Christian who? Some designers are still alive, while someone else designs for their namesake brand. Martin Margiela and Helmut Lang being just a couple of examples. But it's not just movies and fashion. The co-opting and dilution of legacy is everywhere, and it seems to be inescapable. Because this is mostly what we do here on this channel, let's get really deep and a little pretentious, but mostly dramatic. Is this just giving the people what they want? Is it simply nostalgia, or is it necromania? Which, in this context, points to the obsessive desire to live in and revive the past. or resurrected in the case of works that were already resting in peace, as we see with the all-too-familiar remake or reboot? Or is it everything all at once? Or they all just the same thing, different sounds? Whether the desire for sequels stems from industry profitability, audience demand, or both, it's clearly something we just can't leave behind. Although the audience should, in theory, be what sustains the relationship, as in sequels are only profitable if the audience enjoys them, it seems to be more symbiotic in reality. Which is to say that sequels also sustain the audience, namely their attention, regardless of quality. People are going to watch it if they're invested enough in the IP. At some point, it steps into sunk cost fallacy territory, if not actual personal identity. Participating in a mediocre edition of a beloved franchise still beats trying something new, unknown, and quite likely also mediocre. You might be rightfully thinking, well, Jade, isn't that kind of what you do? You know, take inspiration from pop culture and make videos from and about them. You would be correct. I exist in an audience-turned-creator purgatory. And all of this makes me wonder, how many people will watch this video purely because of the title and or thumbnail? For anyone and everyone who would still watch regardless, I see you and I appreciate the living daylights out of you, in the least aggressive way possible. Obviously, the main distinction is that my videos are inspired by these works. I'm not selling you original sequels, but I am knitting my own version, it seems. So where do we draw the line? If you've ever learned to paint, you may have come across the term master study. This means studying someone else's painting by painting it yourself. The point isn't to learn how to copy so you can just keep copying, nor is it to practice painting similar compositions in the same style. The point is to study the technique and perspective of the person who painted the original, to study how and why they painted it the way they did. And sure, you'll learn more than just that, you'll learn techniques you may not have learned otherwise, and you'll reach a better idea of what works for you. At the end of it, you'll have broadened your horizons, making your future paintings just that bit more informed than before. The point is that they're still your paintings, not someone else's and not some derivative slop. I'm not comparing what I do to master studies, they're just a good example of literally copying an original work for a valid creative purpose.
It's just not working.
Quite fittingly, this time pun intended, the waistband was looking terrible and needed its own sequel.
I think I'm gonna have to redo it.
Hold on a second. Have we just been asking for the wrong thing this whole time? Should we actually be asking for sequels to bad movies instead of the good ones? Surely they can only get better. I'm voting for a sequel to The Room. The Disaster Artist biopic didn't count. Another example of basing new work on existing work would be sampling in music, depending on the degree of the sampling and its effects. And yes, it's different to remixing, but let's not get into that. Although this has in some way, shape or form been a thing for most of the last century, it has evolved over the years, with the dawn of hip-hop being one of the major turning points in making sampling pretty much the norm, if not just expected today. And what ends up happening when a contemporary artist samples a decades-old track or song is kind of a lot, in a cumulative sense. Not only is the sample often taken from a work that already has some level of proven success and popularity, i.e. legacy, but it can also trigger a certain nostalgia for either the original piece or the vibe of the time it was from, whether you were there for it or not. Quite simply, things that sound good are timeless, and it makes sense that artists today aren't willing to let truly iconic riffs become lost to the sands of time, especially when trying to make one yourself isn't so easy. It's like adding cream and sugar to coffee. You don't need it for energy because the caffeine is already there, but it softens the harshness. It adds body. It adds sweetness. And that's a game changer, especially if the coffee itself isn't that good. Let's be honest, this goes for a lot of coffee, and I'd argue the same goes for a lot of modern music too. If we take the sampling out of the equation, all the acid, jitters, and anxiety, with none of the sweetness or fat to mellow things out. The only argument I'm going to make, or more like suggest, against sampling is that there is a risk of relying too heavily on it and using it as a crutch instead of a means to evolve. It's like AI, which is only able to take what already exists, remix, and regurgitate it. Sometimes you listen to a new song, and that's pretty much what you're getting. Thankfully, there's still a lot of talent out there, so I'm not worried about that personally. If anything, we just have to make sure our attention goes to real artists over the machine, and that's a whole other topic altogether. These aren't perfect analogies for the sequel, by any means, but the hope is that the essence comes across. No one's saying everyone has to be original and exist as individual islands teeming with creativity, while totally cut off from the rest of civilization. That's just not how it works. But it is to say that no one is asking to see a painting that looks like a poor imitation of an original when it lacks the same soul and core appeal. At the same time, a lot of people do actually want to listen to a track sampling an 80s song instead of the original. Armand van Helden's I Want Your Soul, which sampled Saida Garrett's Do You Want It Right Now, comes to mind. Both are good. One would certainly not be without the other, but they both offer something different. The painting is an example of something that just isn't as good as the first, and the latter track is an example of something that isn't necessarily better than the original, but is different enough to make it enjoyable as its own thing. And isn't that what we're all looking for in a sequel? The collective memory and celebration of art belongs to all of us. And while the idea of it being repackaged and sold to us without the same essence we fell in love with is kind of giving shrinkflation's sneakier sibling, skimpflation. Skimpflation is when a manufacturer skimps out on the things that make up a product by reducing the proportions of certain ingredients or elements, substituting them in part, or replacing them altogether with cheaper alternatives. If you're familiar with the UK chocolate drama, you may have come across the discourse surrounding how some chocolate products no longer contain the same ingredients or proportions that they used to, namely an increase in vegetable oils and a decrease in cocoa and milk solids in the case of milk chocolate. Instead, what remains is this unbalanced, sickly sweet, chalky and/or plasticky mass that doesn't have the same satisfying snap, nor the smooth and creamy texture and taste it did back in our childhoods. And the people of Britain are fuming, livid even, and rightfully so. Chocolatey biscuits are not the same as chocolate biscuits, and there's no disappointment quite like committing to the same brand for decades, only to be met with something increasingly unfamiliar underneath the shiny packaging surface. If this was a marriage, these would be grounds for divorce. Don't even get me started on ice cream and the slow but steady decline into frozen dessert territory. Ladies and gentlefolk, this is the enshittification of joy in real time. I think some, if not most sequels these days, are not immune to this very phenomenon. They may even be a key example of it, if not a contributing factor, by proving to those in charge that instead of if you build it, they will come, it's if you make slop, they will eat it, literally and figuratively, as long as you make sure to get the packaging right. Will there come a time when we no longer know what true joy could and should look like? Has that time already arrived? Based off of what I'm told by older generations, I'm convinced I just don't know what some fruits and vegetables are even supposed to taste like. Which means it's been happening. This whole time. We're just being randomly spawned into it on the way down. But at the very least, most of us still remember the good stuff, even if it's all relative. Maybe we hang on to the original movies for dear life, and support their sequels, because it's somehow both proof that things getting worse isn't just in our heads, and that what was possible once might just be possible again. We jump at opportunities to relive those moments and memories, only to be reminded that lightning never strikes in the same place twice. But what can be guaranteed is that it will strike again, someplace else, and like good sequels, maybe somewhere nearby. Should we let go of the safety that comes with familiarity if it's no longer serving us, or serving at all? I'm very much asking myself here. The sequel may not be a genre in and of itself, but there is a genre that is the sequel. I'll admit, my desire to avoid disappointment has very much influenced my decisions when it comes to watching movie sequels, and I'd say I've been leaning heavily towards avoiding them more often than not. And I don't know how to feel about this very realistic optimism I read in movie reviews, particularly the ones for The Devil Wears Prada 2. No one was expecting it to live up to, let alone outdo, the first movie, but a lot of people still found a way to enjoy it nonetheless, which is good, but it makes me wonder, so long as things are good enough, at what point do we finally say enough is enough, especially when good is by definition relative here? If I'm totally honest with myself, I enjoy The Devil Wears Prada more today than I did back when it came out. I also realize that the reasons I enjoy it now versus then are also totally different. It's only now that I get to look back and have both versions of that enjoyment, which makes things make a lot of sense. It might just be the reason this video exists. For me, The Devil Wears Prada will live on in my knitted pieces, the videos I've made, on the odd occasion I end up rewatching the first movie on a rainy day, wrapped up in blankets, while knitting or crocheting my next project. That's how I'm choosing to remember and enjoy it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to all my supporters over on Patreon for helping to make all of this possible. I will see you again in the next one.